Hello and welcome to the Eloquent in the Room podcast, episode 20. Yes, we have reached another O. We did it. I'm so proud of us. Woohoo! By the way, I'm Rose Cooper. How you doing? This is also episode 6 or part 6 of an ongoing series called Adulting Consent. We've been covering the topic of consent from a lot of different angles over the last few weeks. So if you haven't tuned into those, do go back and have a listen. In the meantime, we're going to be talking about how best to teach adults how to teach children about consent. So to get us into the mood for that, Simon says, sit the fuck down and listen to this podcast. When I first started laying the groundwork for this podcast, I did so thinking that there were quite a few holes in public perception that I needed to fill. And I was also on the lookout for people who could fill my holes of perception. But one very big thing on my agenda was, how do we change the way we educate children, not only about sexuality, but also about emotional intelligence? See, I was a child who grew up in a very dysfunctional environment and had the traumatic events of my childhood happen to me this decade that has just passed, as opposed to the 1970s. I would undoubtedly have received at least some counselling. Myself and my siblings would have at least some recognition that many of our feelings of insecurity and inadequacy that we had growing up had a root cause that we could point our finger at. And I can say with absolute certainty that a whole stack of self-destructive behaviours that I possessed in my teenage years and in my early 20s probably would never have emerged in me. But back in those days, children didn't have a language for what we were going through, and we were essentially gagged. The things we as children were experiencing were apparently inconsequential, unimportant. They were definitely inconvenient and embarrassing. They were whispered about. They were the essence of taboo. We as children had no concept of personal boundaries because the adults around us wouldn't have known a boundary if it was vomiting in their morning cornflakes. We all know better now, at least that's the hope. That word boundaries is well and truly in the vernacular now. We all know what it means as adults, don't we? Don't we? No? Oh, for fuck's sake, Google it, will you? During this series on consent, I've been shining a light on people who live for the concept of boundaries and connection and communication that reside around consent, particularly between adults, and particularly about sexuality. And during the course of this, I have had this thought in the back of my mind that wouldn't it be great if there was a really comprehensive sort of boundary teaching thing out there for kids? And no sooner did that idea pop into my head, and I saw a post that was shared on the Wheel of Consent Instagram. It was a post by a vivacious New Yorker by the name of Sarah via her Instagram handle, Comprehensive Consent. Oh, I like the sound of that. It's comprehensive. So I investigated further. Now, the thing with Instagram is you cannot throw a metaphorical rock without metaphorically hitting a whole bunch of experts in the field of sexuality and all things clitoris related and vulva related and consent related. Not all of these accounts are qualified. Some are just selling vibrators and whatnot, and some people aspire to educate but are not yet qualified. So it does take a lot of sort of sorting through the wheat to get to the chaff, or is it the other way around? Anyway, but wow, Sarah's page just blew me away. Think about it. Adults who use Instagram and follow hashtags looking for information to help them navigate mysterious taboo topics have never had it so good. But, what about kids? Not just savvy TikTok teens, but what about children? Parents are understandably worried about their kids being exposed to porn about social media, but we have to face the fact that that ship has sailed. There's no way to slay that dragon, but we can minimize harm. How? By teaching kids about boundaries, body autonomy, consent comprehensively from a very young age. We're not even talking about sex ed, just foundational things like boundary setting. Wow, when I reflect on my childhood, I know for sure that if I knew what boundaries were, I would have known what love actually looked like. I would have recognised manipulation and coercion and grooming a mile away. How different some of my sexual mishaps and such might have been. How different some of my friendships and relationships would have looked. How differently I would have lived my life. How differently, definitely, I would have parented my 3 sons, because seriously, I haven't always been the best example for them to follow, but luckily they turned out to develop not only healthy boundaries, but also are feminists who genuinely give a shit about the world around them and whom, for the most part, understand their cis male white privilege. Or they do their best to remain vigilant around recognising it. But this is a best case scenario. Indeed, it's a bit of a fluke if you ask me. You can probably hear in my voice a certain emotional component to this particular preamble, this episode. Recent events in the Australian political arena and high-profile tragedies that have occurred recently, locally and internationally, serve to remind us of just how many violent crimes against women are committed every fucking day. Every hour of every day, every minute of every hour of every fucking day. And it reminds me to never be complacent. The statistics speak for themselves. I personally have been so blessed with the people who I have met and clicked with on Instagram who have agreed to be interviewed about consent. As with previous interviews, I went into it without writing a list of questions, but with Sarah, I had particular curiosity about what inspired her to want to go down this particular path, to see where we had similarities. The path of coaching parents and teachers about how to talk to children of all ages about consent and personal boundaries, as well as working directly with children herself. This is a calling. This is a vocation. This is important work. And she's a fucking natural at it. So I wanted to know where that came from. Interestingly, this question inadvertently kicked up the topic of religion for the first time in all of these 20 episodes. It's not like we get too deeply philosophical about religion, but I realised during and afterwards that religion is where I have the biggest blind spot when it comes to the topic of sexuality and consent and the whole darn shooting match, because I was raised by agnostics. This religious guilt trip thing was never my cross to bear. Oh, that's where that saying came from. My problem with boundaries and consent issues as I was growing up had zero to do with religion. It was just about society and my parents who were stitched up by their own hang-ups and fucking their childhood shit. So religion is definitely a conversation that's been missing so far. So if you're particularly religious, that is your content warning or content note. Maybe keep your finger poised on the skip 30 seconds option while you listen to the podcast if you want to avoid that particular rabbit hole we briefly venture into, but please, by all means, keep listening to the podcast. I could have cut this chat into 2 portions like I have previously, but because of the very specific nature of it and the targeted audience, I'm expecting that mostly interested people like parents and teachers would be more interested in listening to this. I have edited out all the extraneous bits to keep it as short as possible, even though we did talk for a couple of hours. I was very self-indulgent with our talk. I was asking her all sorts of stuff and picking her brains, which probably wasn't relevant stuff for my listeners. So yeah, this is the nuts and bolts of the conversation. What remains is an invigorating discussion between Sarah and myself about her programs, which I believe are absolutely essential components to any personal development curriculums aimed at school-aged human beings things. And a quick heads up, this is not the best sound quality. We didn't have the best connection, so apologies for that. Now, without further ado, with your consent, I will play this interview. So let's start at the beginning. How did you get involved in this kind of work?
Where to start the journey? Briefly, I do think it's important that I grew up in a Jewish Orthodox home.
She said Jewish Orthodox.
Also very supportive and emotionally aware parents. It's very interesting to be in an environment where you are told you loved, you are supported. My parents both worked and both came to every soccer game of mine that they could. And I'm one of 5. So that is very impressive.
Also.
Yeah. So to that, but then to also have this book of laws that says what your body is and is not allowed to do and how your purpose is to worship God. And so I think that dichotomy kind of set me up for something interesting ahead, especially being kind of like a psychologically minded person, just because that's what makes sense to my brain. That's kind of the very beginning. I went through school, got a degree in psychology, went to school to become a psychologist, learned very quickly that's not what I wanted to do.
Okay. Specific reason, what sort of stood out to you that you're going the wrong path?
Yeah, there were 2 things. The first was, I interpreted that differently. I was going to answer the question, any reason why you didn't want to, but you're asking, is there anything that made me realize I didn't want to?
Yeah.
Yeah. How I realized I didn't want to was just tuning into my body. I was excited about the classes. I was already seeing clients my first semester. I wasn't excited about the clients.
Oh, okay.
I found it to be very like a checkbox. And when I explored further, there was something about, I didn't like the power dynamic of they were looking at me like I had the answers. And I knew I didn't, but I still didn't feel comfortable being in a position where someone thought that of me. So that was piece number 1. And then piece number 2 is my friend who is earning her doctorate this year, Molly St. Dennis, said it great. She said, Sarah, I think this is a little too serious for you.
All right.
And I absolutely laughed in her face because I was like, you are correct. Like fun and games and energy and doing therapy is not that. You can have a degree and go on to do things that are that, but you got to go through a lot of the not high energy stuff first, at least in the States.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from there, I traveled a little bit. I became a yoga teacher, and I also discovered acro yoga. And for anyone who's not familiar, it's an acrobatic practice where instead of using like trapeze or an aerial silk, you're working with someone else's body to create stunts and tricks. And through that, I started to realize that the conversations I was having in acro yoga were the same conversations that I wanted people to be having on dates and in the bedroom. So things like, have you tried this before? Are you comfortable with this?
Yeah.
Do you need any other safety measures, precautions in place? And then while you're actually doing it, checking in. How does it feel? Are you ready to move on to the next stage in this flow? All those little things, I'm like, oh my God, this is the connection. It absolutely was like a lightning bolt moment.
How far into doing it did that correlation hit you?
I was practicing pretty regularly, going to at least a class a week, probably for about a year.
Oh yeah. Were you in mid pose when it sort of?
I was at Washington Square Park in New York City, and I was with there you go. I was with my two like closest acro friends, Colleen and Alondra, and I literally, it was like we were laying on the grass, and all of a sudden, like I come up, I go, guys, this is what for sex. This is what I couldn't get the words out.
All right.
And they were like, they know I have sometimes big ideas and they were like, yeah, totally. But I couldn't get it out of my head. now I can't stop seeing through this lens of consent is this everyday thing that has nothing to do about sex and everything to do about communication.
Yeah. When people get it, it's so nice to have conversations and unpick it even further. But when people are still sort of, no, what? It's sort of like it's deflating and soul destroying when you feel like that connection isn't being made.
Yeah. They were like, they agreed with me, but they just weren't like this excited,
Yeah. Anyway, continue that journey.
Yeah. And so with my background in psychology and mostly working with kids and skill building, and having now this understanding of, or this idea of breaking down consent into these skills that don't have anything to do with sex, I came up with, was a workshop that I was going to offer to my private Jewish school that I went to when I was a child, where I could teach about consent, where it had nothing to do with sex. Weren't into it. They said they'd think about it. Things came up. They never got back to me. I kind of kept on. I had this in the back of my head, and it eventually changed from this, what was going to be one workshop based in acro yoga for my high school, slowly but surely has become what is now comprehensive consent.
It's comprehensive.
Which is my company that's basically devoted to being consent, an understanding of consent that is nuanced and about communication as opposed to about sex, into as many schools and homes as possible. And there's not an acro yoga component, mostly because of accessibility. I would offer a workshop for sure, but I want to make sure it's accessible and interesting. So the acro yoga workshop is still like at the heart of where that's part of the seed, but now it's very much based in activities and games and stories and metaphors and analogies for just understanding consent differently, and focusing really on the social and emotional piece of it, about how it's not just how to ask, how to accept a no, or how to ask for consent, but like asking for consent is really hard. No is hard. Hearing a no is hard, and preparing for what that situation looks like so you can navigate through it as best as possible, because there are no directions, because every situation is different. There's a different power dynamic. You're in a different mood that day than the day before, the moment before. Very much based in mindfulness and social emotional learning.
Yeah, I think the biggest lesson I learned just as a human being in relationships was just, I think I ended up having an argument. I've been married twice, with my first husband, and he came home in a bad mood or all this sort of stuff. And I was like, wrong? Is there anything wrong? And I was immediately trying to find out what I had done wrong to put him in this mood. And at one stage, he's like, I'm just in a bad mood. Sometimes you've just got to let that go. I'm just in a bad mood. So, and oh gosh, how old was I then when we had that conversation? I was definitely in my mid-20s at some stage. And I remember having the dual realization, yes, he's right. I don't have to own his moods or know when, if I've done something, he'll tell me or whatever, rather than continually trying to find guilt in every situation. But also, why don't we know this? Why isn't this something that my mother told me when I was a kid? Or, this, to me, it's a really fundamental thing, is that ownership of who you are and how you affect the outside world, and how much of it is just feeling of rejection, all of these things, as you were just saying, just understanding that when two people interact, there's two universes at play, and in very rare moments, those universes commingle, and it's a beautiful thing. But for the most part, we are completely and utterly independent in our thought and our feelings and our every single process. And we can't just open our skulls and swap brains and and help each other understand who.
I think just one of the hardest parts is that for so many adults, they still haven't learned this.
Yeah.
And so how can they, honestly, how can they be expected to teach it to their kids? And so that's where it comes down to both parent education and also education in schools, so that they do have that understanding growing up and can bring it into their homes.
Yeah, I think that's what people who object to sex education being taught in schools, or people who object to the age at which or want to dictate the age at which these conversations start. I think they should start right at the very beginning, because they have this blanket rule that this is a conversation that parents should have with their children, but they're overlooking the fact that not every parent knows everything. Not every parent is good at communicating these things, and not every parent feels comfortable. So you've got all those barriers against this actually happening at home, and gosh, it's a bin fire. It's just really like people are just ignoring it.
Bin fire, I would say dumpster fire. I love it.
Yeah, well, I don't know why. I don't know why that particular image popped into my head.
I love it.
It feels like it's in a bin. It's still on fire. People think, no, that's fine. That's fine. That's not gonna get out of control. It's all good.
I take such issue, not even with the consent piece, but you're not expected to teach your child math. You're expected that they go to school, they learn about it, and then they ask questions to you maybe if they need a different perspective.
Yeah.
But how can you expect to teach, or even be, especially when it comes to the human body where there's advances and we're learning new things every day? You're staying up to date on the research, Mom? I don't think so. How are you going to teach them about different methods of birth control? When's the last time you were on birth control? You're in menopause, like, or you know what I mean? Or you're
absolutely
a lesbian and you've never had to worry about birth control, like whatever it is.
Yeah.
It drives me wild that that people think sex education is something for the home.
Yeah.
Only.
So initially you got a bit of resistance. At what point did you feel, were you able to actually, I wish I had a better word for it, sell the idea of what you're doing and get people to jump on board with it? It
didn't happen until, I was still working a part-time job, and at an office in organizational psychology. And I was teaching kids yoga on the side as well. I was very much doing the gig thing. And then I was working on this, but there was no urgency behind it.
All right.
No urgency behind it. Eventually, I did decide to play around with the idea of cold emailing schools without any website. I sent them from my regular Gmail account. And I had one school who was interested. And so I created a workshop. I created the workshop before I pitched it, but I refined it, hosted it, and I thought it went pretty well. And this was on Valentine's Day of 2020, and pandemic hit.
Yeah, gosh. Yeah.
Yep. And so I was like, well, doing a workshop that's heavily experiential is not going to be a thing that's taking place anytime soon. So between that and then also my work with kids yoga and with my office job being cut down, I had a lot of free time on my hands, and I don't sit still very well. So I got to work thinking like,
is that a New York thing?
It is. It very much is. Very much is. I got to work thinking about if kind of like they talk about your why. My why was I wanted kids to understand how to practice these skills and how for it to become second nature before it had anything to do with sex. And so I didn't necessarily need the workshop. The workshop was the how. I didn't need that. I could find a different how. Yeah. And so that's where I decided to create something that was, now that I had like at least a little bit of proof of concept, this something for students was mostly made already. And so I got to work doing that. And eventually I wasn't doing any other work, still not. And I decided that I'm going to launch this company and figure it out as I go. It's been fun, and I've been getting good feedback. So
yeah, what made you come up with that phrase, comprehensive consent? Because it could be in some ways a little bit foreboding for some people who just think, oh, it's too much to learn just because it's got the word comprehensive in front of it.
That didn't scare me away from that because I thought that was important. Yeah. I think it's really easy to think you understand consent And I don't think actually a lot of people do.
Mm.
I think it's very much, there was the movie that just came out recently called Promising Young Woman.
Yeah. It is. Yeah, I have seen it. You've got to be prepared for it.
So without any spoilers, oh yes, you have to be prepared for it. And without any spoilers, they very much talk about you see the idea of the good guy, putting good guy in quotes.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, when it comes to consent, have that understanding that they're a good guy, that they practice consent, but that's because they really believe that they do, but they don't. They don't know what it is. When someone calls them out for not practicing consent, they're like, what? No, that's not true. And they get very defensive. And so I really wanted comprehensive consent in there to be very clear that it's consent is all I talk about. This isn't like a 2-minute video on consent and tea that you can add to your sex education workshop. There's a lot to go into here. There's a lot of components because we're talking about two people. When it comes to boundary setting, not that that's not in itself a ton. I'm talking about boundary setting, but also pleasure and also asking and also withdrawing consent. And also, there's so much to it. And I stand by that. So I think that's where that came from.
Yeah. I don't want to bring gender into it but you kind of have to. How does that play out when you're doing your workshops and you're talking to classes of boys and girls? Is there ever any differentiation between boys and girls in that work?
I could answer that. The workshop, the in-person workshop that I did was at an all-girls high school.
Yeah.
So I didn't have that experience.
Is it something you think about incorporating or yeah?
When I talk about gender, I talk about gender like this. There are very clear sexual violence statistics, and there are certain gender norms that are put onto us in society.
Yeah.
Every person regardless of gender, needs to know all consent skills, from asking to responding and everything in between. That's the baseline. From there, is it likely that boys will need more instruction and support over asking and rejection? Probably.
Yeah.
Will women need more support in the boundary setting piece, or girls need more support in the boundary setting piece? Possibly. I hope that we get to a place, and I hope that in some homes or in some communities, it's how much those gender norms play out will vary. And when they start to practice consent will vary. And so I don't teach specifically content for boys and specifically content for girls, because A, where does that leave the non-binary folks?
Yeah.
And because B, I really and I think it helps almost that I am a very confident woman because, and I'm delivering this. And so I do feel like I can be a model of, you could say, you can say no, you can stand up for what you want. It's very different than a man telling them that they can say no and they can stand up for things. And I try to be very aware of how I am modeling consent while also teaching consent, in terms of how how the boys then perceive me. I think hopefully is also, I try to be a model of how to treat someone who says no, and what the difference between authority and not authority is. And get into all those little complexities, not just in when I'm talking to them, but in when I'm interacting with them. So that's kind of how I've conceptualized gender and how it plays out as I continue to grow in this. We'll see.
Yeah. So with your programs, or what you've compiled so far, do you feel like you've created a space where you deliver a message, and it helps you know the limits of that, and you can work within the limits of that? Or do you ever find that it's each session that you might end up being an organic situation in which you may find a new conversation to have with young people about things?
The conversation can go in many places, But most of what I do is not conversation based when I'm in the room with kids. It's experiential.
Okay.
So for example, like I have a game where you have to go around the room, keep asking people for a hug, and the rule is you have to say no. So they get kind of practice in asking and being rejected. But then we go to the next level, which is, okay, now the person's going to give you a Hershey kiss, you're going to give them a Hershey kiss. Then you're going to say, can I have a hug? And they're going to say no. And so it's like the idea of like you owe someone something because someone just gave you something. And how is that different?
Okay.
And so it's very much about like trying out these different roles and feeling these different experiences in your body and then talking about them. So the talking about it can lead to different conversations. But it's pretty set up in terms of like, all right, time for the next game. Whereas like with just conversation, your transitions need to be a little bit smoother, I find. Unless you're like next topic, maybe. It's very like, all right, game debrief. Because especially with, kids or high schoolers, even like their attention spans are not super long. So I teach for that. And I want them to be engaged. And again, I want them to feel it in their body and not just think about experiences they've had in the past, but now they have this shared experience to talk about.
Yeah. And do you observe the little light bulb go on, whether it's a child or a teenager or whatever, or do you sense when it's hitting home or when it's just not getting, they're not getting.
Yes. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Trial and error. You're always going to learn something. What you think is a brilliant idea, you try it out. It's not the idea that you thought was okay. Turns out that's the light bulb moment.
Yeah. So how do you feel going into it, seeing as that you are you're workshopping your workshops as you go? I have so much admiration for what you do, because you're breaking new ground with what you do. It's like you're very passionate and you believe in the core message that you're getting across. But learning what's going to work is something you kind of need to step back from. And I'm not sure how well I do it, stepping back from an idea that I had and thought was going to work, and to see it doesn't work. So how does that sort of, how do you feel while it's happening? Like what are your feels doing?
I've had a good amount of practice in stepping back. And so I'm pretty good at it. I actually, you can tell from my Instagram, the entire month of January was devoted was leading up to this launch of a program called Parenting for Healthy Relationships. It's going to be a one-to-one program. And while I was launching with it, I was working with a client one-to-one as a case study / guinea pig. And she knew she was in that. We did like a super reduced price for her. And I was like, I want to, before I do it for my full price, full launch, I want to, make sure I know what I'm offering. It's now a month and a half later, I don't offer the program.
Oh, okay.
I spent a month working up to this.
Okay.
I worked with my case study client and she got a lot out of it. It was not what I thought it was.
It's not something you can.
It is
tailor.
Not what I do best, and not aligned with my mission. It's great. Yeah, it wasn't right. And so I had to step back from it, and it was just like, I'd rather do that than force something that doesn't work. I left I left the top doctoral program in the country. I shouldn't say top PsyD program in the country.
Yeah.
I also left college my first semester. I went back, but I had mental health things going on, and I left and came back. And I think you have enough of those experiences, or I left Judaism. You have enough of those experiences. You're like, I'm doing this, but it's not working out. Like, I'm out. It's boundary setting.
Yeah. Where did you learn to set boundaries? What was your first experience with the concept of boundaries?
I wish I knew. I have 4 older brothers. And I've always been a little feisty is what I've been told. Spunky was the word used a lot.
Words that give girls. It's me being very personal in this interview right now, asking you how do you keep that forward movement, keep that pilot light going? I
think the answer is accountability. And what I mean by that is that don't always stay on track, or I don't always go, I don't always stay on track, and I don't also always go as fast as I want to go. So to the first point of not staying on track is I had this big launch where I worked super hard on it. I don't want to think about how many hours I put into the content created behind it. And it was a learning process. So I'm still happy about it, but I could have kept going down that path and just been like, it'll work. It's important. It's going to be good. I'll just fix it. And because I didn't want to admit that I was wrong. And I think learning to notice when something doesn't feel right and take a look and then take action accordingly allows that when you're going down a path and you go far, far away, it's a lot harder to come back to it. But if you only go a little bit off the path, it's easier to get back. And so I kind of just try to make sure that when I make decisions, they're in line with it. And if they're not, the way back is a lot smoother. And in terms of not going as fast, that's a simple, just remembering like from when I first had the idea to when I actually did the workshop was like a year and a half. And that's just remembering that you're not losing sight of the path. If, you got to work a job to support yourself while you're on this passion project. So you'll go a little slower, but you're still on the path.
Yeah. So along your journey between studying and coming to forming your own teaching and all this sort of stuff, at which point did you get in contact with Betty or discover Betty, or the other way around? How did that work? How did that come to be?
I discovered Betty after I had already became incorporated, probably through Instagram, and it just clicked. It made so much sense. At first I looked at the wheel and I thought it looked very overwhelming, but I listened to a podcast that Betty did where she talks about it, and it just blew my mind. I was like, this is incredible. I don't implement it. I implement some of the concepts behind it with kids. I implement it more in my own personal life. I haven't quite figured out if or how the wheel works with kids.
I guess because our brains aren't supposed to fully form, particularly in the frontal lobes and consequences, all that sort of stuff, till we're in our early 20s. So it would be hard to have the notion of forethought. How have you divided the age of children and the concepts you're bringing to the table? Like we call them infant school. I think it's prep. I'm not sure what you call it in America. It's age 5 to 8. Like
kindergarten. Yeah. Elementary school.
Elementary, yeah. Then grammar, and then high school, isn't it? Yeah. So we're like infant school, primary, and then secondary school. So or high school. So yeah. How do you feel the differences, or what sets apart, for instance, that elementary and grammar school? What's the basic difference there between kids' cognitive abilities and what you're wanting to teach?
For elementary school, I won't go in and teach to them myself. I will teach the teachers, because me going in means absolutely nothing. There's no connection. There's going to be no reinforcement. I'm fun. I've worked with little kids a ton. I teach kids yoga, and I could theoretically teach them some mindfulness. But I can't really effectively in, an hour session. It would have to be like 6. for them to know who I am and understand what I do. And even with that, I would still really need the teachers on board reinforcing it in the child's play. So that's kind of what I have planned for teachers is for the younger kids. I teach you, you teach them. Because they know you, they're going to be reinforced by you. They have a relationship with you. You see what's going on. You know what they need.
Yeah. So they use what you teach them.
And then
on a day-to-day basis of just bringing those ideas and concepts to kids on or do they actually lessons around it specifically?
Both.
All right.
Both. There are specific lessons and games that teach them, ideas. There's like a game with like scenarios and you can say like yes, no, or I don't know. And the question is like, do you think they got consent? And then they go to like the green if they think yes, they go to the yellow if I don't know, the red if no. And then have a conversation about that. So they're moving around, they're moving their bodies. It's very gamified, but I'm not leading that. The teacher is, because then again, like the kids can then, it's the cutest thing that kids, one of my favorite things about kids is that they talk to you about people that you don't know as if you know them. They'll like to be like, so my friend Lucy, remember how she ate spaghetti today? And you're like, no, why would I remember that? I'm an adult. I wasn't in your class, but they don't have theory of mind. So they don't realize that you don't know something. So with a teacher, they're more likely to understand what the child is talking about, what their context is, what their family life is, and they can just integrate it better for a child who, again, can't fully express themselves or know what someone else is expressing. And so there's specific, games around it. And then there's also teaching about like, what is body autonomy? Why is it important? What do you do with little kids who especially it's definitely not about sex at all. They're pushing someone on the playground. How do you talk about consent then? Someone's poking someone in class. Someone wants a hug. Someone wants to hold someone's hand to the playground. These are all like everyday examples of how do you integrate consent into those encounters.
Yeah.
And for grammar school, it's a lot different because teachers aren't doing that with their kids. It'd be really inappropriate for them to with a sixth grader, talk about, or I shouldn't say it's inappropriate. I don't think the kids would want it for their teacher to be like getting into their friend group business. They think they know everything.
Yeah.
And so then is when it is a little more appropriate for someone new to come in. I'm not your annoying teacher. I can use my energy. I use like I use like clips from movies. I use games to make it, interesting and fun. And it is a requirement that the teachers are present. That isn't like their hour break while I go teach, so that they can also integrate it where it's possible. But the biggest piece is for the kids themselves to understand so they can talk to each other about it as opposed to talking to their teacher. And then eventually, I have not worked on this at all, but I would love to implement a peer-to-peer program because that I think would be even more effective for like an 8th grader to a 6th grader. I think that would be, an 8th grader would be more influential than me.
They've automatically got the 6th grader's attention.
Yeah.
Just by being.
Right. And so it's realizing where your influence lies and like how much you can do. I can go into the, 2nd grade classroom fine, but it won't stick. So what's the point?
Yeah. Do you find that with teaching parents or adults or teachers these concepts, is there a space for the idea that because the first thing that comes to my mind as a parent as well, and just observing other parents and things that we teach children because we think we're teaching kids the right thing. And the thing that sticks out to me is the sharing concept. Like kids have a toy and parents bully their children into sharing the toy because it's supposed to teach some kind of generosity to children. It's like this is a word to them. Share is a word, particularly really, really young kids. Share is a word for giving someone, doing something I don't want to do. It's really, it seems when you're an adult and you really think about it, you think, actually, that's really basic. What are we doing? Why are we doing that? How much of unlearning are you sort of bringing up when you approach these things, even from the get-go?
90% of what I do is, if not 100%, is unlearning. Because whether we realize it or not, we learned about consent when we were young. And if you didn't have consent education, you learned consent didn't matter.
Yeah.
So you learned something by not learning something. And so it's so much unlearning. I do not say you must share. There are, in fact, I encourage that kids have certain toys that they don't have to share no matter what. And other toys where, a parent can set the rules about, okay, in 10 minutes, it'll be time for them to have that toy. But you still have your special toys that it doesn't matter how much, if you want to play with it and you don't want to share it, you don't have to. Because I'm totally with you. Like, there are some things I do have to share, like the TV. When I grew up with 4 older brothers, I have to share that with everyone. That's not mine. But why do I have to share the Barbie that I got for my birthday? They never wanted to share that, but theoretically.
The difference between compromise and self-sacrifice.
Yes, and I in fact use the word collaboration very intentionally, because when it's compromise, you kind of each get something. So from the TV example, I get to watch the end of my show, but then, and my brother has to wait. And then it's his turn, so I don't get to watch anymore, but now he's happy. Whereas if we collaborate, it could be that there's a TV show we both want to watch. And so you kind of broaden the scope of the problem to create a solution, because I think that's what happens sometimes in touch too, that people compromise instead of collaborating. Yeah. So you want to have sex, I only want to make out, so let's meet in the middle. Yeah. Like, what? Yeah. Like, that's not how that works. That's not a compromise that I'm comfortable with. Yeah. Whereas if you collaborate, you get to the root of what does each person want? And each person wants, let's say it's connection, or each person wants to be held. And they think that kissing is the only way they get it. And the other person thinks that sex is the only way they get it. And it turns out they cuddle and they're both happy. Yeah. That's an ideal situation. Who knows if that happens, but you're just using the word compromise brought that up for me. Yeah. No, I totally understand. And fundamentally, the things that I've discovered just as a human being and getting older and growing into my own body autonomy and like the entire premise of me starting the podcast was the fact that I have been able to compare times in my life between relationships and before and after where I was sexually active. Makes it sound like we were running at the same time. When my late teens, my mid 30s and my early 50s, these 3 completely different times of my life, and also different times in the history of this, sexual revolution and how consent changed, how much more empowered I was in my 30s, how much more assertive I was in my 30s, but also how I kind of centered things around my ego. I was very insecure. Then to be over 50 and feel so within my rights to halt anything at any stage, to say no to anything at any stage, to ask for things, to set out the ground rules at the beginning, to call people out when they were being in any way hurtful or, but it took my whole life to get there. And I always feel like, oh, what can I do now that I know this stuff? What can I do? So knowing that you're going right back to the beginning and getting kids to just learn that self-awareness and compassion and empathy and rejection and all of these things that we learn later have words attached to them, but you're teaching them these things as concepts without needing words attached to them. It's a personal question. How much of what you're doing
is driven by personal experiences where you wish, whether you had like whether it was heartbreak or other things that have happened in your life that give you a greater sense of purpose because you feel that there's something that you discovered through that process that made what you're doing make so much sense now and give you so much purpose.
A very good question. My dad asked something very similar. He goes, did we do something to you that I'm not aware of? I was like, no, you're good. I really think autonomy has always been something that was very important to me. Like it always just made sense to me. And I think that's why I had a lot of issues with the religion in which I was raised. Because within any religion, you're not making the rules, and the rules aren't based in ethics alone. They're based in ethics plus some other arbitrary things and some non-ethical things. And I think that really set me up for like that internal struggle of, but again, having that support. So being told my voice was important, but at the same time being told it wasn't, that mixed messaging.
Yeah.
I think really laid the groundwork. There isn't one experience that I can point to growing up that has defined this. I think it's like a lot of little experience where I was just like, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. I don't like that. Why do I have to I couldn't understand why I had to wear skirts to school. I had to, and that was not comfortable for me. Yeah. I wanted to like sit on the floor with like my legs out and I couldn't. And it just, I think there's something in every person, I really believe from the time that they're born, that knows that their body belongs to them. And then we're taught that it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so I think my experience was exaggerated, but because of religion, or exaggerated in some way because of religion, but it's the thing you live in always. It's the only thing that's literally yours. Yeah. Your government owns your house if you have the bank does if you have a mortgage, and you can move cities, you can move states. As far as I know, you can't move out of your physical body in the world in which we live.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a lot of coming back to that very practice of, no, you get to choose your body. You have to be kind to people.
Yeah.
And you're going to experience hard emotions, but your body is yours so long as it doesn't infringe upon the rights of others.
Yeah. I grew up, my parents were agnostic or atheist or whatever. So I have this interesting sort of cognitive dissonance or whatever towards how much religion can actually affect people's sense of, the rules, because the rules never made sense to me. But I had other rules imposed upon me that were just, the usual garden variety, sexist, old-fashioned views about what I should be doing with my life and my role in the family unit, and no, I wasn't taught to have any sort of aspirations or stuff. And on Instagram, there's a few people that are doing stuff that's specifically about purity culture, which is obviously religious based and all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, I was kind of a lawless teenager. Grew up in the 70s, or my, sexual awakening was in the 70s and late 70s, where I knew that sex was my birthright. I still didn't completely piece together the level of empowerment and body ownership that I should have, but I still felt that I shouldn't be discriminated against or vilified for wanting to have sex with people or how many partners that I had or any of that stuff. So I find it's an interesting blind spot for me when I'm dealing with wanting to talk about sex and educate people about their empowerment and stuff, is that and even having interactions with men in my 30s and stuff where I was the more assertive partner, and thinking about it years later and thinking how much of me specifically thinking all men want sex was driving my interactions, and how much of some of those situations were men going along with the fact that, oh, this woman wants to have sex with me, okay, and they could have had a religious upbringing and thought, I just want to get to know her better. There's so much that I have that's a gap in that regard. So it's interesting to know that the fight that I had was for autonomy and to be taken seriously, and that was purely a social thing. It was never never fighting against any kind of religious doctrine or rules or whatever. So I'm really on the fly here, seat of my pants here. Do you remember times during your upbringing where you're learning about religion and stuff, where you saw the blinding hypocrisy of or the sexism of what you were learning? Did you like put your hand up in the class and like, but what about if she doesn't want to or whatever? Was that always there?
Yeah, that was always there. I'm also thinking now of what you said before. I'm going to answer this question, but the also the interaction of religion and social issues, because I was also the more assertive one.
Yeah.
And when I was, as like a 17-year-old, rejected from a boy who I wanted to kiss, that to me was so confusing, because I was like, you're a boy who never gets, female attention. And I just offered you a kiss. You're rejecting me. Like, I must really suck.
Yeah.
Like, where it almost hit even, like, there's different ways those interactions play out in terms of both who might be the aggressor and who is aggressing and who's going along with what, and also just the emotional implications of all of that.
Yeah.
Or them having shame for wanting to say yes, but also wanting to say no. And
yeah, it seems like it's something that you only ever figure out in retrospect.
Absolutely. Judaism, luckily, as opposed to some of the other religions, as far as I understand, very much welcomes questions and contradictions. So I have a friend who was raised Catholic, and she says that she brought up things and they were like, shh, don't say that. Don't say that. Where for me, it was like, interesting, let's talk about it. And it would still be there would always be, can't know God's will. There's a disagreement. Some rabbis say this, some rabbis say that, but they weren't shut down. It wasn't like you are questioning God, so you're shut down. It's like you can't understand it sometimes. Let's go down this trail as far as we can, and then when we can't anymore, it's like, and sometimes we don't understand it. So it wasn't real frustration that I had to suppress of like speaking up. I was able to do that. Our Talmud, which is kind of a commentary on the Torah, the Bible, the first book, it's all debate. It's just rabbis debating the whole time, and we learn that. And so it was very nice to have that within it, but still the rules about it only mattered so much that in class we were able to debate these issues, because at the end of the day, the school rule wasn't going to change. So I still had to wear a skirt to school. I still had to not use my computer on the Sabbath. I still had to do all of these things. So there was still frustration, but at least I could in some ways talk about it openly. So
you didn't feel stymied as a female, to have critical thinking within that?
Yes. Luckily in the sect that I grew up in, women were encouraged to be critical thinkers as much as men, minus the social implications that all women feel. Yeah.
It's so interesting, because it really only hit me just then that not only was I brought up without religion, my father was quite anti-religion, and because it was mostly a WASP kind of upbringing, as a kid, you learn a lot of things because of the jokes that are told sometimes. And there's, a lot of these religious jokes, and mostly it was like Protestant and anti-Catholic. So, because Australia is very much early settlement, and that is mainly from the UK and Ireland and stuff. So those two differentiations are very much at the forefront. And we had a mass migration from most of different nations during gold rush periods in the 1800s, and also after the war. We were actually paying people to come and live here. It wasn't exactly a few acres and a mule, but it may as well have been. We were paying people to immigrate, particularly. But that's a whole other topic. But what I was going to say is that I remember I had a friend who was brought up in Catholic school. We were both in our early 20s, and she said she remembers the day she had a conversation with someone and it caused her to question her religion for the first time. And I remember my reaction to that was, because I was raised anti-religious, like, how could you not have questioned it from the get-go? Because I just had my own bias about it and without even really looking into it. Having said that, when I was a child, I had a friend who was religious and she had a lot of influence on me, and I found that I did have kind of a spiritual vacuum in my psyche that I was like, I need something to believe in. I've now come to realize that human beings do have this spiritual vacuum, but it's more about just love, connection, all of these sort of things. But people are encouraged to purify that and engage it only with religion. And
it's like with Stockholm syndrome or, abusive relationships where you might not realize it. And
yeah.
I love to talk about the first time that I very explicitly went against my religion, because it's hilarious. When I was 16, so my family observed the Sabbath, which means from Friday evening to Saturday night, no driving, and it's a day for family, and you can hang out with friends and chat, you can read, but you can't do a lot.
Yeah.
And I was 16 and in a lot of rigorous courses. I was always a strong student, and it was Saturday, and it was the summer where it feels even longer. I was like, I want to get my math homework done so I can have free time tomorrow on Sunday where I can actually do something fun. And so the first thing I did to break religion was to do my math homework. And that was my rebel. That was my rebellious thing, because it wasn't about this. And this is whenever my parents use the word rebellion, and even still, I wasn't rebelling against the religion. I was just advocating for myself and my time. I was just what do you mean I can't do my math homework today? If I don't do my math homework today, I can't hang out with my friends tomorrow. And I can't hang out with my friends today because I can't have someone drive me to them. So why can't, I'm just going to do my math homework and then I'll have time tomorrow. This didn't feel right. Why does someone get to choose when I get to do my math homework when I'm just bored doing nothing? And that always just makes me laugh.
Yeah.
Such a rebel.
And how religious were your parents?
Pretty. Again, they sent me to a school where I had classes with boys, and but I did have to wear skirts. My dad goes to synagogue every day. My mom goes to synagogue on the Sabbath. We eat kosher, or they eat kosher. So pretty religious. Socially, they are doing their best to be liberal. My mom wants to understand what it means to be trans and asks questions hoping to get there, but also can't. She understands because Bible is men and women according as she sees it, and so she can't get past a certain point, but she would still treat someone perfectly well, as much as she can control her unconscious bias. So things like that happen, but my mom, if given the chance, would murder our last president. So we got that going on.
She's won me over.
Yeah, right. So again, and that's what I mean. They were these supportive, in many ways progressive, loving, accepting people. They were never trying to prove anyone that Judaism was right. It was just this is what we practice. We had a Catholic nanny and she did her thing and we lived together and it was fine. And but also in the foreground was this thing of no, you don't get to make choices. This is how it goes. This is how life goes. Your job is to get married and have kids and wear skirts and cover your hair. Whatever.
It's that search for meaning, and it's been rebranded over and over and over again, but it feels like it's a way of controlling people on one hand, but on the other hand, there is so much good there So, just the basic fundamentals of Christianity, just being, put yourself in the other person's shoes, turn the other cheek, all of this stuff, which is love in action, love as a verb, all this sort of stuff. And then you get these people who want to take a book and find a chapter to interpret a certain way, something that was, written via hearsay, told in fables, then interpreted over and over and over again, and we're supposed to use it in 2021. And why people don't just blank out at any point during that, this, I don't know.
I'm like, oh, I was a kid. I get why I didn't see what was happening. But now as an adult, I do have what you have, I think, which was like, how do you not see this? How do you not see that this is not feminist? Like, how do you, I have those reactions too sometimes.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a swap out for religion. And unfortunately, I see spiritual. I've always said I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. But even then, that's starting to be too heavily branded for me, spirituality. And, people sort of crystals, mandalas. There's a lot of cultural appropriation happening across Buddhism and Taoism, and everyone's just sort of it's. But ultimately, we as human beings and as countries and as the world, we need to get back to the most basic of things, and that's just being connected, being mindful, being kind, being nice. And yet capitalism is what it is. So
this soapbox rant is brought to you by Sudsy Soap. It's got no soap and no substance.
It's not comprehensive. Rebels living in the sewers. It feels that sort of, covert thing. Like, I believe in love. What do you believe in? Oh, I want to make a lot of money. So with religion, it's a question that popped up while you were talking. With religion, how is that factor in when you're approaching schools? Like, obviously some schools are based in faith. There's still Christian values taught in some schools and whatever. So how do we get around that, or how do you assimilate what you're saying with what you're allowed? Is there schools that sort of say you can say this, this, and this, but make sure you mention God at least twice or something?
There will be no mention of God in my work. That is a hard no. If a principal, school psychologist, whatever, wants me to say something that I don't believe, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
I make it very clear that this isn't sex education. I don't talk about sex, so it shouldn't come up.
It's interesting that the topic of religion came up at all. I don't ever have a list of questions when I'm interviewing, because I love the things that come up by accident. And have you had experience of parents giving you feedback that they've learnt things, that you've brought something to them, not just their parenting, but also to them personally?
Yeah, that's been the most surprising. Was I learned the word reparenting from someone who messaged me telling me that that's what I had kind of given them, and I've since heard that word a bunch of times in messages that my community has sent to me about
expand on what that means.
Sure. So I think some people still have never been told that they get to decide what happens for their body. Like, some adults have still never been told that, or have been told that, but haven't heard that because they've been told the other message, your body doesn't belong to you, so many other times. So just bringing out, I know one that hit real hard for parents. I say parents, but it's mostly moms.
Yeah.
So one that hit home for moms was, I asked the question of what was nurtured, your desires or your desirability? And that was one that I got a lot of feedback on, that it was like, oh, my desirability was nurtured. My desires were not. Now I understand. Now I have context for why I made so many of the decisions that I made, because I was trying to make myself desirable instead of thinking about what I desire. And that one I know specifically was a post that hit home for a lot of people, and especially people with daughters, about, right, okay, am I teaching my daughter to be, how am I encouraging them to present themselves to the world? Or what am I giving them reinforcement on, and what am I not giving them reinforcement on?
The standard compliments they receive.
Yes, exactly, right. Beautiful, cute, sweet, not strong, brave, smart.
Yeah,
exactly. Right. What is it that women are, men do? I think is the phrase that women are sweet, are kind, are caring, and men like create, build, destroy. Like they do. They so the reparenting
respond.
Yes, exactly. The reparenting is very much like a kind of realizing how the messages, how parents were raised, and how these parents are now going to take that information and work with it. And I think also try to bring it into their kids' lives so the same doesn't happen there.
I didn't have daughters. I've got 3 sons, and I always, there's part of me that would wonder, if I had had girls, would I have done a lot of overcompensating? Would I have been overprotective? Would I have been, controlling? Would I have minded my own business? Because my radar would have been out all the time. I just would have been expecting to have to help them navigate. Whereas raising boys, I took the opportunity to have conversations when the opportunity arose, like if we were watching something on TV and they would laugh at it. If it was a sexual connotation, I'd say, tell me why you found that funny, because I want to know what you understand, where you're at with that. So I just like look for the opportunities to have ask questions. And if they did start dating or whatever, just throw in the, how do you feel about her? Is this a casual thing to you or whatever? And if it is a casual thing, have you had the conversation around what she's in it for? As it turned out, I was overcompensating. They grew up to be feminists because they're millennials and Gen Z anyway. I think it's really hard not to raise feminists these days. They're the first generation to actually laugh at what we grew up thinking and see it as ridiculous. And, why, particularly, and I'm loving the gender discussions. I'm learning so much. I actually preempted this interview at the end of my last podcast, just sort of reflecting on the fact that as a parent, I did the thing that my parents did, in that encouraging my kids when they were babies to hug people, to kiss people, whatever, that were my friends, to call them aunt and uncle or whatever. And looking back and just realizing how much of that plants a seed of the affection transaction and not really learning personal boundaries from it. And then the potential for it to go horribly wrong later in life doesn't occur to us as parents. We just want the approval of whoever the other adult is by getting our child to be the go-between. There must be an interesting awareness for you of how much you're teaching parents to be better parents as a subtext of everything you do. You're teaching parents to be better parents against their better judgment, because the things that we do when we're talking about those situations not only seem harmless, they seem positive in our logic. It's not twisted logic. It's just the way we were raised. Hug grandma, say thank you, for things that you're not necessarily grateful for, all this sort of stuff. So it must be an interesting headspace to be in sometimes.
Yeah. Most people don't take parenting classes. And so you teach what you learned. Unless you're seeking something else, and anyone can become a parent. doesn't take much. You don't have to pass a test to become a parent. And so you're gonna take the advice that you see on Instagram because it's free as opposed to buying the book or taking the classes. And so it's really not surprising that we're kind of in this territory of generational trauma and generational cycles because of it. But that's kind of where my course that I was taught, or the program that I was talking about that I spent a month on and then abandoned, or more than a month on, that was very much about that parent-child relationship and being a better parent in general. And that's not what I do. The consent stuff teaching consent will help parents come to being their own better parents. But teaching it directly is not what I do. So it's very adjacent, and that's why I kind of veered off that path. But at the end of the day, what my mission is and where my skills lie is in really talking about navigating touch, noticing what you feel in your body, noticing the messages you're sending and how behavioral psychology impacts us, and how to navigate hard situations related to talking about the body, something that is so, shamed generally.
Yeah. Is it a hard thing to remain positive? There must be some times where you feel a little bit dispirited about how much impact it will have in the long term, or, given all the other influences that are around.
It is hard. It really is. When I do happen to come across something, a story, a tweet or something, or hear news that they're not teaching consent in Texas because they don't think they need it. It definitely is hard, but it's an infinite game. I can't prevent sexual assault. I can't guarantee consent. All I can do is increase the number of people who understand how to practice consent. So as long as I keep increasing that, then that's all I can hope for.
Yeah. You can do what you can do.
Yep.
Absolutely. I feel like we've come to a natural sort of end anyway. Do you have any things that you want to bring up that you don't feel like you had a chance to talk about?
No, this was fun. I don't usually get to talk about this other stuff. It's usually just very much about my work, but we got the gender stuff in and the religion and reparenting. So it's been really great to chat with you. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm glad that you're happy that we went off track because that's kind of the way it goes with me. I splinter off into all the directions. Covering the topic of consent, it's so nuanced. And just introducing the concept that it is nuanced and it's not simple. It feels like that's where I'm finding a place. It's like, you think you know what consent means? Think again. So yeah.
Comprehensive.
Yeah, it is.
Comprehensive.
It is comprehensive.
It's comprehensive.
You should do something with that word. It's cool. It's a cool word. Comprehensive.
I'll think about it.
Yeah, think about it.
Yeah, I'll let you know.
Then you can thank me after you've had a good think about it.
Yeah.
Sarah, absolutely delightful talking to you. Thank you so much for giving me your time. I feel so privileged. And I will add your links and everything in the show notes of the podcast. So lovely to meet you. Thank you so much.
So lovely. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that despite the sound problems. There was some internet instability at my end. I think the sound tech at the other end wasn't that great. So I hope you bore with it as well as you could and picked up as much from it as I did. I found it all very inspiring and all very reassuring, knowing that there are people like Sarah out there in the world, and it's my privilege to tell you guys about it. So if you want to do everyone a solid, share her website, share this podcast. And if you like this podcast and you want to do something to support it, I'm not in any way earning money from this venture at the moment, please do me a big favour and like, subscribe, comment, share it, follow me on Instagram, drop me DMs to give me some feedback. It's a community, it's a networking, and I really want to bring voices like Sarah's and Betty Martin's and Wyo Lee and other wonderful people who are doing the best that they can to give us a more loving, more exciting, more fulfilling, and most of all, safe space for us all to inhabit and to feel good about. Because, there's not a lot going on in the world at the moment that we can feel good about, is there? Give yourselves the biggest hug for me. Until we talk again next time, I won't spoiler anything that's coming up. We're going to give the topic of consent a bit of a rest. Not entirely. We're still going to be in that ballpark, but we're taking it for a bit of a walk. There's some really interesting stuff coming up ahead, so please stay tuned. I love you all. Oh, and happy St. Patrick's. Takik me nies Jenny hu. Yeah, that was my feeble attempt at saying see you later in Gaelic.